Good evening, everyone. We are now in Leviticus chapter 21. And I want to draw your attention before we start. In Leviticus chapter 21, it has the continuation of what we have been talking about, as in Taher, which is pure or clean, and Tameh, which is unclean or contaminated. Now, why is this important? Is because in this chapter, we are going to focus on the priests, the Kohanim. And remember, what we have seen thus far is that we have been always talking about God's house, and then it's God's rules. And the guardian of God's rules in God's house are the priests, the sons of Aaron. And in the earlier chapters that we have seen, they are to administer all the offerings, the various offerings, and the rules of the offerings, about the sacrifices, the slaughters, and then all the skin diseases, how they would pronounce something clean or unclean, because the priest is the guardian of God's house. God's house is holy. God's house must be clean. Now, as much as the priest looks after all the people who are coming to ensure that they are clean, else they will contaminate the house of God, it is also important then that all those rules that apply for the sons of Israel actually applies to the priests. But as guardians of the house of God, there are other strict rules, particularly for the priests. And so let's begin. And when you take a look at chapter 21 here, it begins by saying, and then, after we have completed chapter 20, and then Jehovah said to Moses, he says, speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, they are the priests, and say to them. And so what is important now is that this actual chapter is specifically, it is not to the sons of Israel, but it will be known to them. But the laws here concerns the maintenance of purity, the maintenance of purity, and they cannot make themselves unclean. And these rules apply to the priests, the sons of Aaron. Now, oftentimes people say, oh, you cannot keep all the laws of Moses. And the answer is true. Because when this chapter 21 comes out, it is not for everyone. It is only for the priest. So nobody can do this. It is to make sure that the priests and the sons of Aaron are considered pure and clean while they are in the service of God's house. Remember, God's house, God's rules. No tameh, all must be taher. And so let's begin looking at this chapter. It says this, none shall defile himself for the dead among his people. Remember, this word defile literally means to be unclean. The priest cannot be unclean. The people, if they are unclean, they have to go and deal with it, go through quarantine, inspection, and then the ritual of atonement. And so for the priests, even more importantly, they cannot intentionally go and become unclean, especially even when they have somebody dying in the family. So now we have this. For the dead means if anyone amongst them dies, except, now except means as a exception that does not include this. What does it not include? If it's dead among the people, the priest just can't go near. Because we have already seen the carcasses of animals will make a person unclean for the rest of the day. What more the carcass of a human being, except for his relatives who are nearest to him. Now, what does that mean? It means that these are by relationship the closest, the closest to him. And it is described. The description is very clear. It is the mother, the father, the son, the daughter, and the brother. Now, this is important because these are the exceptions. If that ever happens, yes, he is unclean only on account because somebody in the immediate family died. Now, verse 3 also tells us there is another provision that his virgin sister, who is near to him, so near to him meaning the sister, the daughter of the father, who has no husband, for her he may defile himself. He may make himself unclean in this situation. Now, why is this so important? Very clearly, I think we will understand in the Hebrew culture, it is a very patriarchal environment. The men are the ones who are always given the authority to take charge of matters and issues to protect the women. But in this case, if her sister, who is near to him, has no husband and she dies, then he may make himself unclean. Otherwise, the husband is the one that is to take care of things. So we see two words here. This word in the Hebrew is batula, meaning she has not never had sex with anyone. And by inference, uh, she would be somebody who is likely not married, or if married, uh, then she would have had sex with him. So the idea of Betula would be unmarried, would be a good way of assuming. Now, to actually strengthen that view, then it says who has had no husband. And that these two actually helps to understand that she has no one to care for her. Now, in this case, the priest may make himself unclean to take care of the sister. This is important because in a patriarchal society, the husband always deals with it for the wife. But since she has no husband, then this priest can do that. And so it gives that provision. Otherwise, he shall not make himself unclean. Why? Because it says here, he is a Baal among his people. He cannot defile himself. Now, this is important for us to understand. A priest, a Kohen, is actually a Baal. A Baal means a chief. Among his people, priests are actually leaders. Priests are actually the head of the people. And if that is the case, he cannot make himself in a dishonor position. He cannot dishonor himself. He cannot make himself common. Now, what does that mean? Because he's a priest, he cannot behave as a non-priest. There is no option for him to say, well, for this period of time, I'm not a priest. Understand this, that the role of a priest is a chief among the people, and they are sons of Aaron, is by birth. This is a birthright given to the sons of Aaron to be the chief among his people, being priests. And so he cannot say that he would take a holiday and say, I'm no longer a priest for a period of time. It does not exist in God's books. That is what this means. So being a priest is a very special position, but a very strict position, because it is a responsibility that God views as extremely serious. Remember earlier, the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, they actually offered strange fire, burning incense to God in a way where God never instructed. Perhaps they were offering incense that other people of other nations did, and so they thought it would be fun to do that. And so God struck them dead, burned them up, consumed them like a consuming fire. I just want to impress upon all of us, because we have never seen priests, we don't think much about priests. The priesthood in the nation of Israel, in the order of God, God's house, God's rules, the caretaker of God's house are the priests. And only what they say goes. And so, as a chief, they cannot make themselves a non-priest or a commoner. And that's what it says here. Now, moving on, we can read this. They shall not make any bald place on their heads, meaning they're not supposed to shave their head. That's fundamentally what it is. Make bald means to shave bald. The reason is that hair is natural, but of course, man can lose hair. That is not making bald, it's naturally bald, right? So, if a person is not naturally bald, the person cannot become bald for whatever the reason. Nor shall they shave the edges of their beards, nor make any cuttings in their flesh. Remember, we talked about this earlier on. The edges of their beards would be that if they have beard, they are not supposed to shave any part of their beard. It is supposed to be left natural. Cuttings in their flesh. Now, this idea of cuttings in their flesh is an idea of marks, right? Marks. Or tattoos, I guess that's what people would like to call it. And the reason why the nations do that is because of slavery, because of branding, because of association. And the priesthood is not a triad. The priesthood doesn't require any marks of identification. You don't have any stars on the garments. There is no special markings, and particularly not in their flesh. And so the priest of God is clean. That's what it means. It's clean, untouched, pure. They don't have branding or any marks that says, I belong to a particular God. Because the priesthood of Jehovah is not a triad, it's by birth. There is no such thing that somebody can join the priesthood. And so there is no such approval for them to behave like other nations. They shall be special to their God and not make themselves common. That's what profane means. Make common. the name of their God, because the priest carries the name of God. They are God's guardian of the temple, of the tabernacle. For they offer the offerings of the Lord made by fire and the bread of their God. Whenever people come to the tabernacle, they bring the slaughter and they will slaughter the burning, the olah, each of the asham, the khatat. All the offerings are done by the priest. And because the offerings is holy and special, they are to be holy and special. They are not to make themselves common like everyone else, because they are making offerings to God. Therefore, they shall be holy, just as the people are told to be holy in chapters 18, 19, and 20. Today in 21, it is very specific to the priests that they too shall be holy. Now, when you look at the rest of this passage, they shall not take a wife who is a harlot or a defiled woman, nor shall they take a woman divorced from her husband, for the priest is holy to his God. First of all, think of it this way: they cannot take any woman as wife. There is a restriction. That is what it means. So, what is that restriction? The restriction is she cannot have been a harlot or was a harlot at the time, because that would make him associate with the unclean and the practice that will cast a doubt on his character. It cannot be a defiled woman. Now, what is a defiled woman? The idea of a defiled woman can come in a few forms, right? For example, it could be from a woman who was divorced, a woman who was a harlot, from all that kind of relationship which casts doubt on the cleanliness or the purity of the Kohen. So one who is born in some unfit form is usually the case, a daughter of a widow of somebody, right? And it would disqualify them for all intents and purposes. So this is part and parcel of the ritual and the laws. Nor shall they take a woman divorced from her husband. So divorcees and children of divorcees, daughters of divorcees, is a problem. This is God's law. Now, you may think that, well, she's divorced, so she's free to marry, which is true. To everyone else, it is fine. But to the priest, no, because she was once somebody else's woman. For the priest is special. So the priest must treat himself different, right? Treat himself different. And which is why in the book of Ezra, towards the back end of the book of Ezra, when they came back from Babylon, the priests and were to divorce their Babylonian wives and send all of them back to Babylon because of these laws. When they were there was no temple. And so nobody cared. But now that they are back in the land, they are going to build a temple. What happens now that they already have a wife who is not part and parcel of the people of the nation of Israel? So many of these things have to be reset. And so you can take a look at the end of the book of Ezra for this. Moving on, you will see, therefore you shall make him holy, for he offers the bread of your God. He shall be special to you. For I, the Lord, who sanctify you, am Kadosh. The daughter of any priest, if she makes herself common by playing the harlot, that she goes and sells herself, she makes her father common. She shall be burned with fire. And all I want to show you is that these are laws particular to the priests, for both the priests and the children of the priests, the sons and the daughters. Verse 10. Now, verse 10 narrows down. So you find that the high priest, the great priest, actually is not really called the high priest. It is called the great priest. I think it needs to be corrected. It is Kohen Gadol. It means that he is of a highest position, of the high position, highest position. And so that priest, among all his brethren who are also priests, and so you find that on whose head the anointing oil was poured, who is consecrated, where the garments is all the so-called the high priest garments, shall not uncover his head nor tear his clothes. Now, what does that mean? If you look at this, in verse 10, he is not to uncover his head. This word here, uncover his head, has to do with the idea of mourning, right? He cannot let loose his hair. He shall not leave his hair unshorn as a gesture of mourning. And so you leave your hair uh, unshorn for a period of 30 days for mourning. So you do not practice the regular commoner mourning. So no signs of mourning with regards to the hair, nor tear his clothes for the grievance. And so you notice in Hebrew scripture, you find that oftentimes when somebody is very angry or very grievous and very sorrowful, they would tear their clothes. And so the high priest or the Kohen Gadol cannot do that, because those are expressions of the commoner. And a priest themselves is special and much more the high priest. And he is told he cannot go near any dead body, nor make himself unclean for his father or his mother. The priest, okay. High priest, not okay. He shall not go out of the sanctuary, nor profane the sanctuary of his God. He cannot make unclean the sanctuary of his God. He's to be in the sanctuary of God. Only he alone. For the consecration of the anointing oil of his God is upon him, that he is anointed by God, consecrated by God for this very special work. That's Aaron. And then notice all these statements, Ani Yehovah. Remember, every time we see this Ani Yehovah, it is to tell them, I am God and you are the high priest. You are not God. And so you need to listen to God. It is a serious call. Then it says, and he shall take a wife in her virginity, which means that she cannot have been married before. That's verse 13. And so a widow, a divorced woman, or a defiled woman, or a harlot, these he cannot marry. That is very, very important. But he shall take a virgin of his own people, which means the 12 tribes of Israel, as wife, which means that he cannot take anyone that's outside. Now, what happened in the book of Ezra is that it is a precaution such that one of those sons of Aaron can become a Kohen Gadol. And so it would disqualify anyone to be elected as a Kohen Gadol if they don't meet these requirements. Means what? It means that for a person to qualify as a high priest, as a priest, it should mean that he is already making sure that he is practicing the requirements of the Kohen Gadol. He shall not profane his posterity among his people. Don't make common, for I, the Lord, sanctify him. So I hope that we understand why the priests go beyond the first 10 verses, because they could also become the high priest. And to become the high priest, you must have met the requirements of the high priest. And so it was thought that the high priest requirements should fall on the priests as well. In our last segment here in verse 16 begins this, and then the Lord spoke to Moses saying, so, and then means after everything up there was stated, speak to Aaron, saying this. Now, interestingly, you find that speak to Aaron. Aaron at this time is the Kohen Gadol, the great priest. What happened then to the previous passage? The previous passage is a provision for any of the sons of Aaron in the later time, that for them to qualify to be the high priest, they should have met all those requirements. But here, once you are the high priest, then you are told to focus on this. No man of your descendants in the following generations who has any defect. Now, what do you mean by defect? Verse 17, defect actually means blemish. Most of the blemishes in the offerings in the animals are natural, right? You can't actually prevent any of these. And so when an offering animal is brought to God, it must be perfect. And now when it comes to the Kohen Gadol, then he is told that no man of your descendants, your sons, in the coming generations, and you must tell everyone in every succeeding generation, that if the person or the son or the son's son has a defect, then that son cannot approach to offer the bread of God, which means that a son that has some physical blemish uh, is disqualified from making offerings. For any man who has a blemish shall not approach the tabernacle of God. Who are these? A man who is blind, a man who is lame, who has marred his face by inference, or any limbs too long, meaning an abnormal length. A man who has a broken foot, broken hand, hunchback, or a dwarf. A man who has a defect in his eye, eczema, scab. This means that this is all skin problems. Remember, we had in chapter uh, 13 and 14 that there are passages there that talks about skin diseases and discharges. So that's some of the defects, because it is going to persist and it's considered unclean. Or is a eunuch. Now, this is an interesting expression. Let me then give us some expressions now. In verse 20, it says this: one with a defect in the eye talks about a membrane in the eye that he can't see well, possibly cataract, possibly cataract. In verse 20, a person who is hunched, uh, we can say, well, should we say that he's a hunchback? I think this is about drooping. Someone who is hunchback, but there is another translation that says he's got extremely long eyebrows, but I don't know how that could be translated into this case. But a hunchback is seen as a defect in the eye, looks fine, you can still see, but you are blocked. Eczema are actually the skin lesions who's already dry. Scab is actually still moist. And this one, eunuch. The idea of eunuch is really not this word, not a modern word, actually. Um, I think the better way of trying to express this is not a eunuch. It should be crushed testicles. There is a problem with the man, right? And the Hebrew word here is crushed testicles. No man of the descendants of Aaron the priest who has a defect, a blemish, shall come near to offer the offerings made by fire to the Lord. He has a defect. He shall not come near to offer the bread of his God. He may eat because he will have a share. He is still Kohen, sons of Aaron. All right. The most holy and the holy. He can eat the bread that is assigned for the priesthood. Only he shall not go near the veil or approach the altar because he has a defect, lest he make common my sanctuary, that it wouldn't be holy anymore. For I, the Lord, makes his sanctuary holy. So I hope that you understand what this means, that one who has defect is seen to be incomplete, not because of his own fault. Sometimes it could if you broke your own foot, but sometimes it is born that way. Sometimes you can't help it where you've got eczema. Sometimes you can't help it where you have some of these skin problems. Sometimes you could have an accident. But in any case, one thing for sure, God says that you cannot be defective when you offer, but since you are still a priest, you can take part in eating what is assigned to the priesthood. That's basically what God is saying. Because God is holy. He is holy because he is clean. He makes his tabernacle clean. My sanctuary is clean. And so anyone who comes near to bring an offering, to burn an offering, to deal with all these offerings must also be clean, must also be pure, must also have no defects. Like the offering that is brought to God, the animal cannot be blemished. And so now, as we end, the final words, verse 24. And then Moses told it to Aaron and his sons, and to all the sons of Israel. Now, why is this so? First of all, this chapter primarily talks about Aaron and sons, the Kohanim. God wants the rest of the children of Israel to be aware. Why? Because if they are not aware, can you imagine that there's a death in the family and the priest decided not to go? They would be thinking, hey, you are dishonoring your father and your mother, or dishonoring the people in your community. But since now the people now know that God has a strict law, a very strict law for the Kohanim. If they don't show up in the funeral of the dead, if they don't shave their head, they don't tear the garments, it is okay. So that they realize that the Kohanim, the priesthood, is special. They are holy. They are different. They belong to God. They are the chief of the people. The way they can marry women is very limited. And so all of these, the priest must know and do, and for the rest of the people to empathize with the priesthood, so that in the event of any circumstance that falls into the purview of chapter 21, the people will understand, and the people will not have anything to say against the priesthood, because it is God's house, God's rules, although not applicable to the sons of Israel, it is applicable to the Kohanim, Aaron and his sons. They know not to blame the Kohanim for not participating in the community events, especially in the time of death. And so all of these is chapter 21. These are not laws for everyone. They are laws for the Kohanim. And it's very strict because they are guardians of God's holy sanctuary. They are to keep themselves holy. And if they can't help it, if there was an accident or they were born that way, then they know that they are disqualified from the offerings, but they are not disqualified from being a priest, because the priesthood is a birthright as sons of Aaron. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.